The wind cuts across the ridge like a blade drawn over bone. It is late afternoon on the 26th day of August, in the year 1346, and the sky above northern France hangs low and bruised, pregnant with the threat of thunder. Beneath it, stretched across a shallow hillside between the villages of Crécy and Wadicourt, an army of Englishmen and Welshmen stands in silent formation, their faces turned south toward the valley below. They number fewer than 13,000 souls, many of them common archers clutching 6-foot yew-bows, their backs bent not by fear, but by readiness. Before them, the ground slopes gently downward through terraced fields and marshland, descending into a shallow river valley where the road from Abbeville winds like a serpent through the landscape. On the opposite ridge, barely visible through the dust and heat shimmer, comes the advance guard of an army that dwarfs their own. 30,000 Frenchmen, perhaps more, their banners a forest of silk and steel, their armored knights gleaming like a river of molten iron. The earth begins to tremble beneath the weight of their approach. The Longbowmen plant their stakes into the soft ground, their fingers working over the waxed strings of their weapons with the calm precision of men who have made peace with mortality. Behind them, the English knights stand dismounted, their visors raised, their eyes fixed on the coming storm. There is no retreat. There is no fortress to hide behind. There is only this ridge, this narrow stretch of churned earth and trampled wheat, and the understanding that what happens here in the next few hours will echo across centuries. The wind picks up, carrying with it the distant sound of drums, the metallic clangor of thousands of men in motion, and the low guttural roar of an empire advancing to crush an upstart king who dared to claim its throne. This is the moment before the future changes. This is Crécy. For nearly 3 centuries, the kings of England had been vassals to the kings of France, holding vast territories across the Channel, Normandy, Aquitaine, Gascony, yet forced to kneel and swear fealty for them. It was a humiliation baked into the bones of the English monarchy, a legacy of conquest and compromise that festered with each passing generation. When Charles IV of France died in 1328 without a male heir, the question of succession tore open the old wound with savage force. Edward III of England, through his mother Isabella of France, was the nearest male relative to the dead king, the grandson of Philip IV, and by blood the rightful heir. But France recoiled at the prospect of an English king on the throne of the Capetians. The French nobility invoked Salic law, an ancient Frankish code that barred inheritance through the female line, and crowned Philip VI of Valois instead, a cousin of the dead king, but a Frenchman through and through. For nearly a decade, Edward swallowed the insult. He paid homage to Philip, acknowledged him as overlord, and bided his time. But Philip, emboldened by his newfound power, began to press his advantage. He demanded greater control over Gascony, sought to confiscate English territories, and fostered rebellion in Flanders, the economic heart of the wool trade that sustained England's wealth. Each provocation was a calculated blow, designed to remind Edward of his subordinate status. By 1337, Edward's patience had run its course. He renounced his homage, quartered the golden lilies of France with the lions of England on his coat of arms, and declared himself the true king of France. It was not merely a claim, it was a declaration of war. The 100 Years' War had begun. For 9 years, the conflict simmered with raids, sieges, and diplomatic maneuvering. Edward won a crushing naval victory at Sluys in 1340, securing control of the Channel. But on land, the French held the advantage of numbers, resources, and geography. Then in July of 1346, Edward launched a daring gamble, a massive seaborne invasion of Normandy with 15,000 men. His army sacked Caen, burned a path of destruction to the gates of Paris, and then turned north toward Flanders, pursued relentlessly by Philip's vastly superior forces. The chase ended here, on this ridge, where Edward chose to stand and fight. It was a moment born of desperation and calculation, a convergence of ambition, pride, and the bitter struggle for legitimacy that had consumed 2 kingdoms. The stakes could not be higher. If Edward lost, his army would be annihilated, his claim extinguished, and England reduced to a shadow of its former self. If he won, the balance of power in Europe would shift forever. Edward III of England was 33 years old, a king forged in the crucible of betrayal and ambition. He had inherited the throne at 14, a puppet of his mother Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer, forced to watch as they ruled in his name and dishonored his father's memory. At 17, he had seized power in a midnight coup, capturing Mortimer at Nottingham Castle and sending him to the gallows. That night, Edward learned the fundamental truth of kingship. Power is not given, it is taken. Since then, he had rebuilt the monarchy, restored royal authority, and transformed England into a disciplined military machine. He was a man of contradictions, chivalrous yet ruthless, visionary yet pragmatic. He fought not merely for territory but for legitimacy, for the validation of his bloodline and his vision of a united Anglo-French realm under English rule. At Crécy, Edward commanded with the cold clarity of a master tactician. He had chosen the ground with meticulous care, positioning his forces on the high ground with protected flanks, marshland to the left, forest to the right. He dismounted his knights, stripping them of their mobility, but giving them discipline and cohesion. He arrayed his longbowmen in forward-curving wings, creating overlapping fields of fire that would turn the slope into a killing ground. And then, with unshakable confidence, he waited. Beside him, his 16-year-old son, Edward of Woodstock, who would later be known as the Black Prince, commanded the vanguard. The boy had been knighted by his father just weeks earlier, and now he stood at the center of the coming storm, surrounded by seasoned commanders who would guide him but not shield him. This was his trial by fire, and his father had orchestrated it deliberately. Across the valley, Philip VI of Valois rode at the head of the largest army assembled in a generation. He was 53 years old, a man who had never expected to be king, who had inherited the throne through political maneuvering rather than blood. Philip was pious, ceremonial, and deeply invested in the ideals of chivalry, but he lacked the instincts of a warrior. He believed in the superiority of French knighthood, in the invincibility of armored cavalry, and in the divine right of his cause. His army was a display of feudal magnificence. 10,000 mounted knights, 6,000 Genoese crossbowmen, and thousands more infantry and levies. It was a host designed to inspire awe and crush resistance through sheer weight. But Philip's confidence was his Achilles heel. His advisors warned him to halt, to rest his exhausted troops and reconnoiter the English position before committing to battle. But the king's knights were enraged by the sight of the English, infuriated by the arrogance of this foreign invader who had burned French towns and claimed the French throne. The roads behind the army were clogged with soldiers and peasants, all demanding vengeance. Philip, unable to control the fury of his vassals, gave the order to attack. It was a decision born of pride and pressure, a capitulation to the demands of honor over strategy. And in that moment, the fate of two kingdoms was sealed. This was not merely a battle between armies. It was a clash of philosophies. Edward embodied calculation, discipline, and the ruthless efficiency of a new kind of warfare. Philip represented tradition, chivalry, and the old feudal order. One would survive, the other would be shattered. The English had arrived at Crécy the day before, exhausted but alive. For weeks they had been running, marching north from Caen with Philip's massive army snapping at their heels like wolves pursuing a wounded stag. They had crossed the Somme River at Blanchetaque Ford at low tide, wading through chest-deep water under a hail of crossbow bolts from French defenders on the northern bank. The Longbowmen had led the crossing, 12 men abreast on the narrow causeway, their arrows arcing overhead to suppress the enemy. It had been brutal, costly, but successful. Now with the river behind them and the forest of Crécy shielding their right flank, Edward chose his ground with the eye of a master. The ridge rose gradually from the valley floor, broken by 3 natural terraces that would force attackers to climb in stages, disrupting their momentum and exposing them to sustained fire. The left flank anchored on the village of Wadicourt, where the ground softened into marsh, difficult terrain for heavy cavalry. The right flank pressed close to Crécy itself, with the River May and the dense forest providing natural barriers. It was a position designed to nullify the French advantage in numbers and force them to fight on English terms. Edward divided his army into 3 battles. The vanguard, commanded by the Black Prince and placed on the right wing, consisted of 800 dismounted men-at-arms flanked by 2,000 archers. The second battle, led by the Earl of Northampton, held the left with similar numbers. The reserve under Edward's personal command stood behind the right wing with 700 men-at-arms and 2,000 archers. All horses were sent to the rear, corralled behind the lines in a makeshift park of wagons and carts. The knights would fight on foot, shoulder to shoulder with common soldiers. Their armor and discipline turned into an impenetrable wall of steel. The Longbowmen, the true killers of this army, planted their stakes in the ground, sharpened wooden posts driven into the earth at an angle to impale charging horses. They checked their strings, waxed and taut, capable of launching a cloth-yard arrow over 300 yards with enough force to pierce plate armor at close range. Each man carried 2 sheaves of 24 arrows, and more were stockpiled behind the lines. They stood in forward-curving formations, harrow-shaped wedges that allowed them to fire from multiple angles without hitting their own men. It was a formation designed for maximum lethality, a crossfire of death that would envelop anything that entered the killing ground. The English also deployed an innovation that would become a harbinger of the future: gunpowder weapons. Small cannons, bombards, and ribaldequins were positioned along the line, crude and unreliable but capable of producing terrifying noise and hurling iron balls into enemy ranks. They were experimental, more psychological than lethal, but they added to the arsenal of terror that Edward had prepared. As the sun climbed toward its zenith, Edward rode along the line on a small palfrey, a white rod in his hand, his voice calm and steady. He spoke to his men in English and French, reminding them of their purpose, their courage, and the righteousness of their cause. He told them that the French outnumbered them 3-1, perhaps more, but that courage and discipline would prevail. He invoked God, king, and country, but he also spoke plainly: fight well, and you will be rewarded. Run, and you will die. When he finished, the army ate and drank lightly, conserving their strength. Then they waited. The heat of the afternoon pressed down on them, the air thick and still. In the distance, the first French scouts appeared on the southern ridge, small figures on horseback surveying the English position. Then came the banners, hundreds of them, rising above the crest like a tide of silk and steel. The drums began, a low, rhythmic thunder that grew louder with each passing minute. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble. The French were coming. The Genoese crossbowmen came first, 6,000 men in ordered ranks, their drums beating a steady cadence as they advanced up the slope. They were professionals, mercenaries hired by Philip for their skill and discipline, and they marched with the confidence of men who had broken armies before. But they were exhausted from the long march, and their pavises, the massive shields that protected them while reloading, had been left behind in the baggage train. They were exposed, vulnerable, and about to walk into hell. The English longbowmen opened fire at 250 yards, and the sky went dark. It was said by those who survived that it looked like snow, a blizzard of death that fell upon the Genoese with surgical precision. The arrows came in waves, each archer loosing 6 shafts a minute, a rate of fire 3 times faster than the crossbows could answer. The bolts from the Genoese weapons were deadly but slow, requiring a crank and a foot stirrup to reload. The longbows were relentless, their shafts punching through leather and mail, shattering limbs and piercing throats. Within minutes, the Genoese formation began to waver. Men stumbled, fell, crawled backward. The ground before the English line became a carpet of bodies and broken equipment. The survivors turned and ran, fleeing back down the slope in disarray, their discipline shattered by the sheer volume of fire. And then came the knights. Philip, enraged by the retreat of the Genoese, ordered his cavalry to charge through them, to cut down the cowards and press the attack. The result was catastrophe. The knights, clad in plate armor and mounted on heavy destriers, surged forward into the mass of fleeing crossbowmen, trampling their own men in their haste to reach the English. The slope was littered with bodies. The ground churned into mud by thousands of feet, and the knights struggled to maintain formation. As they climbed the terraces, the longbows found their range. The arrows fell in sheets, striking horses in the eyes, the neck, the flanks, sending them crashing to the ground and pinning their riders beneath them. Knights were knocked from their saddles, their armor punctured, their limbs broken. Those who reached the English line found themselves confronted not by fleeing archers, but by a wall of dismounted men-at-arms, wielding poleaxes, swords, and maces. The fighting was brutal, hand to hand, a grinding melee of steel and flesh. The French charged again, and again, and again, 15 times over the course of the evening, wave after wave of French cavalry hurled themselves at the English line. Each time the longbows decimated their ranks. Each time the dismounted knights held firm. The slope became a slaughterhouse, the dead piling so high that subsequent charges had to climb over their own fallen comrades. Horses screamed, men cursed and prayed, and the air filled with the stench of blood and shit and gunpowder. At one point, the Black Prince's division was pressed hard, the French breaking through to within striking distance of the young commander. A messenger was sent to Edward, begging for reinforcements. The king's reply was cold and deliberate. Let the boy win his spurs. He sent no help. The prince and his men fought on, holding the line through sheer will and the support of the archers on their flanks. By nightfall, the French assault had collapsed. Philip himself was wounded, unhorsed twice, and barely escaped capture. His army, once the pride of Europe, lay broken on the field. Darkness fell over Crécy, and with it came silence broken only by the moans of the dying and the creak of English soldiers moving among the corpses, finishing the wounded with knives. The English had not won through strength of numbers. They had won through preparation, discipline, and a revolution in warfare that Philip and his knights could not comprehend. The longbow, a weapon once dismissed as fit only for peasants, had proven itself the master of the battlefield. Its range, its rate of fire, and its penetrating power had rendered the armored knight, the symbol of feudal supremacy, obsolete. But the true genius of Crécy lay not in the weapon itself, but in how Edward wielded it. He had dismounted his knights, transforming them from vulnerable cavalry into a solid defensive corps. He had positioned his archers on the flanks, creating overlapping fields of fire that enveloped the enemy from multiple directions. He had chosen terrain that forced the French to attack uphill, exhausted and disorganized, into a killing zone where every advantage lay with the defenders. And he had maintained iron discipline, refusing to be drawn into a counterattack, holding his line no matter how desperate the situation appeared. The French, by contrast, had fought as they had always fought, with courage, with honor, and with the unshakable belief that the charge of armored knights could break any enemy. They had no answer to the longbow, no strategy to counter the English formation, and no means to impose order on their own ranks once the battle began. Philip's decision to attack immediately, without rest or reconnaissance, had doomed his army before the first arrow flew. His inability to control his vassals, to restrain their fury and coordinate their assault, had turned numerical superiority into a liability. The chivalric code that governed French warfare, the emphasis on individual glory, the disdain for common soldiers, the belief in the invincibility of the mounted knight, had become a death sentence. Among the dead was John of Bohemia, the blind king, who had ridden into battle tied to his companions, determined to strike one blow for France despite his inability to see. His body was found the next morning, still lashed to the corpses of his knights, his emblem, 3 ostrich feathers and the motto, Ich dien, I serve, later adopted by the Black Prince in honor of his courage. Also dead were the Count of Flanders, the Duke of Lorraine, the Count of Blois, and over 1,500 knights and men-at-arms, the flower of French nobility. Their bodies littered the field, testament to the failure of a system that valued pageantry over pragmatism. The English losses were minimal, fewer than 100 men, most of them Welsh infantry who had strayed too far from the line. It was not a battle, it was an execution. The survivors of the French army staggered back to Abbeville in the darkness, their spirits shattered, their faith in their king and their way of war irreparably damaged. Philip wept openly, mourning the loss of his companions and the humiliation of his kingdom. He had led the largest army in Europe to destruction, and he knew that the blame would rest on his shoulders. For Edward, the victory was total. He had proven his claim to the French throne not through diplomacy or legal argument, but through force of arms. He had demonstrated that the English way of war, disciplined, professional, and ruthless, was superior to the feudal traditions of France. And he had sent a message to every king, duke, and count in Europe. England was no longer a subordinate power. It was a force to be reckoned with. The longbow had become the symbol of that transformation, and Crécy its defining moment. The days following Crécy were a blur of smoke and ash. Edward did not pursue the retreating French army. His own forces were too small, too exhausted, to risk a chase into hostile territory. Instead, he turned north and laid siege to Calais, the strategic port that would become England's gateway to France for the next 2 centuries. The siege lasted 11 months, a grueling test of endurance and logistics, but the French, crippled by the losses at Crécy, lacked the strength to mount a relief effort. Calais fell in August of 1347, and Edward expelled its inhabitants, replacing them with English settlers. It would remain an English possession until 1558, a constant reminder of the humiliation France had suffered. Philip VI never recovered from the defeat. His authority, already weakened by years of war, was further eroded by the demands of his vassals and the resentment of his subjects. In 1348, the Black Death swept across Europe, killing a third of the population, including Philip's queen. The economic devastation that followed compounded the political chaos, and by the time of Philip's death in 1350, France was a fractured, demoralized kingdom. His successor, John II, would fare no better, suffering an even more catastrophic defeat at Poitiers in 1356, and ultimately dying in English captivity. The Battle of Crécy marked the end of the age of chivalry as Europe had known it. The armored knight, once the undisputed master of the battlefield, had been brought low by common archers wielding weapons of yew and hemp. The feudal order, built on the supremacy of mounted nobility, was shown to be vulnerable to discipline, tactics, and technological innovation. Warfare was no longer the exclusive domain of the aristocracy. It had become a matter of professionalism, logistics, and cold calculation. The longbow became the symbol of English military power, and its use spread across Europe. English and Welsh archers were hired as mercenaries in Italy, Hungary, and the Holy Roman Empire, their skills in demand wherever battles were fought. The lessons of Crécy, the importance of terrain, the value of combined arms, the power of defensive tactics, would shape military strategy for generations. Agincourt, 69 years later, would be Crécy's echo, another impossible English victory built on the same principles. But Crécy's legacy extended beyond the battlefield. It shifted the balance of power in Europe, establishing England as a major military force and challenging the dominance of France. It validated Edward's claim to the French throne, even if he could never fully enforce it, and ensured that the 100 Years' War would continue for more than a century. It inspired a generation of English commanders, including the Black Prince, who would carry the lessons of Crécy into future campaigns and cement his own reputation as one of the greatest warriors of his age. And it planted the seeds of a new kind of warfare, one that would eventually render castles, knights, and the entire feudal system obsolete. The ridge at Crécy, where fewer than 13,000 men stood against an empire and prevailed, became sacred ground in the annals of English history. It was the moment when England stopped being a vassal and became a power. It was the moment when the future announced itself with the whistle of arrows and the crash of falling armor. It was the moment when the old world died and the new world was born. And on that field, beneath the smoke and the broken steel, the destiny of an age was rewritten.